Okay, let us then, as we begin part 3 here, talk about Carl Jung. And what do we know about Carl Jung? Well, he was a student, he was contemporary with Freud. He studied with Freud. He was younger than Freud, and we can see the elderly Freud and the younger Carl Jung here. And Carl Jung was perfectly on board with the idea of the unconscious mind, a personal unconscious. He was down with Freud, so yeah, personal unconscious, right? And it was roughly equivalent to Freud's id, right? And then, but Carl Jung hits us with one of kind of the wackiest concepts is this collective unconscious. And this is Jung's addition to the unconscious, involving a reservoir of instinctive memories, including the archetypes which exist in all people. And the idea here is that, how did he come at this? And he was a great student of art, literature, and what he sees is he sees the same themes being represented metaphorically through art and literature since time began. So he says, but why do people from various cultures and various societies tend to return to these same themes over and over again, right? And so he's saying that's evidence of this collective unconscious, a stream of consciousness that we can all tap into. It's like this ether, and I know it's a strange concept. And again, I'll kind of reinterpret this as culture might represent collective unconscious. It's something that we pass to each other, right? And we're not even aware that we exist within a culture, right? What's the question? Dick Nisbet, cross-cultural psychologist, asked us this question in a meeting, and he said, does a fish know it's wet? And we're all like, yeah, but the point is that a fish doesn't know it's wet until it's not wet. And the water represents the culture to the fish, just like our culture, right? We don't really know the impact of our culture until we move away from our own culture. Right, Annika? All right, time to reposition and go back to sleep, I suppose. So, the archetypes are the characters in these narratives and these stories that we share. And they're ancient images that appear over and over again, right? So the hero, the heroine, these are archetypes. Notice that heroine is a descriptor that can be applied to millions of actors, subjects in literature, in film, in sculpture, in art, right? And they appear and they reappear, and in human artistic and creative endeavors. But they connect us to something larger, because there's the hero and there's something to aspire, and we know what heroics are, right? And there's a narrative built around this. And these stories, when they contain archetypes, then become comfortable to us because they resonate and they go back and they tie us to the past, right? So they represent qualities, and Jung is big on balance. A la Hippocrates, right? That we have good and bad. Sometimes we're outgoing, sometimes we're a little inward focused, but good psychological functioning and the ultimate ability to adjust or to adapt is really by operating the balance, recognizing these two aspects of the self and using them in a way that balances them out. Right, Penelope? So, this is how we get to the aspect of healthy functioning. So now, poor functioning is a result to acknowledge the archetypes in the first place and in our collective unconscious, and we may find them unacceptable, right? So we deny them, and then we get into the idea of repression and all those defense mechanisms. Some real simple examples. Animus is the male archetype. So what does it mean to be a man, and how is that portrayed in the art that we see? Anima, on the other hand, is the female archetype, and what does it mean to be a woman, and how is that portrayed, right? Then another example would be the shadow, and this is the archetype representing the destructive and aggressive tendencies we don't want to recognize in ourselves, but we do in fact possess to some degree, right? And these sublimated, borrowing on Freud's word, that is the shadow, these kind of aggressive tendencies, can be sublimated to assertiveness so that people don't walk over me that I can stand up for myself, but learn not to necessarily manifest it as aggression, but as assertiveness. We'll talk more about that when we get to communication later on as well. So, the shadow then, representing those destructive qualities. Now, think about some really important terms that Jung has brought us. He's the originator of introversion, extroversion, at least in the context we understand them. So introversion is a Jungian dimension that focuses on inner experience, one's own thoughts and feelings, and this then has a tendency behaviorally to present an introvert as being less outgoing and less sociable. But note, an introvert, and I think introverts get a bad rap. People say, oh, what an introvert, and they're using it somewhat derogatorily. It's about how people process information, and the introvert looks inward to understand how they feel and to look at their experience of the situation. The extrovert, on the other hand, tends to consult others as to their experience, right? So it's not that one is better than the other, but it is two different ways of processing information. I tend to be largely extroverted, big surprise, right? But I tend to want to hear from others. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Right? And then I take this information in and I might process it at that point. But I often prefer to process information kind of in a small group setting. So the information remains out here and we're all kind of playing with it. Introverts really want to consult internally. So they need time, especially quiet time, to consider what it means and how to further understand it. One is not better than the other. Now, one quality might be appropriate to certain adjustment challenges, while the other quality might be appropriate to other adjustment challenges. So let's go back to Hippocrates, let's go back to Jung. The system of balance then allows us to balance the me time, the introspective time, with the exchange time, the extrovert time. Right? So, introversion, extroversion, Carl Jung. Yeah. Carl Jung extending the unconscious then, this principle then of opposite portrays aspects of our personality in balance, right? Between opposing pairs of conscious tendencies. So there's a lot. To what extent do you rely on the conscious mind, but to what extent do you embrace the unconscious and try to explore it? Introversion versus extroversion, right? The rational versus the irrational. And sometimes it's okay to be irrational, right? We don't always have to be empirical. We can go a little more metaphysical sometimes. Best of both worlds is often helpful in understanding Jung. Thinking versus feeling. Now, let's look at you guys, because most of you are psychology majors. Think about it right now. Introversion, extroversion, and let's go to thinking and feeling. Those are two qualities that are captured in what measure? Now, the measure I'm thinking of has four qualities, four paired qualities. There's two of them on display right there. It's also known as the Jungian Typology. Now, later, it will be rediscovered, renamed, and called Myers-Briggs. Well, whatever. Jungian typology is the origin of it. Intuition and sensation, right? Yeah. Notice, straight up Myers-Briggs. No, straight up Jungian typology. Good versus bad, got to have a little of each, right? Hopefully in balance. The masculine and the feminine. And we look at the new idea of androgyny is combining successfully both what would be considered masculine and feminine qualities into an androgynous being. And notice, if you have that ability, your adjustment capacity goes up immeasurably, because you can call on either aspects of these. You can tailor the aspects of the self that are working in a given situation that enhance your ability to adjust, right? So we got them both, we got them in balance, and then the true wisdom is knowing when to run with one or run with the other. Questions? And you know, if you got questions, office hours, place to come, our weekly meeting, place to come. Let's talk about Alfred Adler. We're still in the psychodynamic people, so we're kind of also doing a little history thing here. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, because now it'll be probably less enjoyable because I used the H word, right? But We're kind of tracing the lineage now. Alfred Adler, 2 basic desires. We have a desire to belong, and we have a desire to feel significant. And he believed that people are motivated by an inferiority complex and not measuring up. So to the extent that my need to belong is being frustrated, that my need to be significant is in fact being thwarted, then I suffer an inferiority complex, and this leads to a drive for superiority. I'm going to do a mishmash here, just an offering at this point in time. What we see often then, especially for the American male who's supposed to be dominant and supposed to be in control, think in terms of most men are not all that dominant, not that much in control. Most men are just worker bees, right? And they have bosses who push them around. They have circumstances that push them around. They have life that pushes them around. So they're kind of confronted with being a worker bee rather than a leader. And this can lead, I think, to an overall sense of inferiority. And sometimes when I see people, that want to march around with rifles, on the street, etc., and it's like, well, there's really no one to shoot today. That's not an area where you go hunting. So the rifle isn't a necessary requirement. If someone was really worried, first of all, they probably wouldn't go out, but if they did go out, they would probably conceal a handgun on their person, right? But to outwardly display, let's say, my tactical vest with all my magazines and then carrying my rifle, what am I doing? What is the what's so behind that? What is the fascinating motivation that's going on there? And I think Adler gives us a pretty good explanation of what might be going on. That in the day-to-day, these guys don't feel like they have a lot of power. That they may be suffering, some sense of inferiority. So they compensate, right, by arming up. And this is an exhibition of power in the face of a subconscious realization of a lack of power. Again, when we use personality theory, is what I just said correct? I don't know. It's a plausible explanation for an observed behavior. It doesn't mean it is the explanation. It could be dead wrong. And I think one of the things that I like about studying personality and personality theory is it gives me a toolkit. It gives me a lot of ways to look at an observed behavior. And then on further explanation, then some of those, further exploration, some of those explanations make more sense. Some make less sense, given the additional evidence that we begin to compile as we explore the idea. And this is why I think personality theory is such an important aspect of psychology, because it really broadens our horizons in understanding ourselves and understanding others. So, Jung, like Adler, believed in a capacity for self-awareness. So Adlerian focus then, right, the psychology focuses on people's efforts to compensate for their self-perceived inferiority to others, right? These feelings of inferiority can derive from one's position in the family constellation, particularly if early experiences of humiliation occurred, right? Physical condition or defect existed, and we see that some of Hitler's top dog henchmen had kind of physical infirmities, right? Goebbels had a club foot. Goering developed a horrible drug addiction. Himmler always felt weak, and he felt that he missed out on being a soldier because he was too young to go into World War I. And he spent all his time then, in fact, dressing up in uniforms, etc. So we see these compensatory behaviors for perceived, but largely repressed sense of inadequacy. Okay. So Adlerians believe that a misbehaving child is a discouraged child. So Adler will look at developmental processes, because he's a psychologist. I'm more of a social psychologist, a sociologist. So the inferiority that I suggested was an occupational one. Notice it comes later in the game, so to speak. But both are consistent philosophically. Now, let's talk about Karen Horny, and I can't tell you guys how pleased I am that many of you chose to take on Horny's writing. I think she's super underappreciated. Feminist psychodynamicism, I don't know if that's a word, it may or may not be, but we get the message. Unlike Freud, Horny argued that little girls do not suffer penis envy. So thank you, Dr. Horny. She believed the interpersonal relationships, right, were influential in childhood development than sexual impulses. So she's more social of the psychodynamic ilk, like Adler, right? She put forth the notion that genuine and consistent love can alleviate the effects of traumatic childhood. And we can see burgeoning family therapy as a result of this. Horny was about anxiety, and she said anxiety is uncertainty and loneliness in response to a perceived hostile world, right? And when anxiety goes too far, then it manifests itself in neurotic needs. These are signs that manifest as normal needs taken to neurotic extremes. Fascinating kind of approach to it. So especially when we look at anxiousness and neediness, that is, these needs were not satisfied in childhood. And notice that a lot of the psychodynamic people place a great deal of importance on childhood. So I want to talk a little bit now, move it towards Erickson. And Erickson is one of my favorite psychologists. He's super organized and super orderly. Where Freud was talking about sexual energy, or like I said, sensual energy, or sensual gratification, if you will, as a developmental force, Erickson viewed the social world as much more important component of our development. And as a social psychologist, it probably makes sense why this would resonate to me, right? So Erickson's theory is labeled psychosocial instead of psychosexual. And for those of you who've studied child development or lifespan development, you spent some time with Piaget, right? And Piaget takes us to adolescence, and then he doesn't want to bother with us anymore. He's decidedly cognitive in his approach. Notice that Erickson's social in his approach, so he takes us through the entire lifespan. So Piaget had how many stages? If you're saying 4, you would be correct, right? Well, Erickson's got 8. How many stages, developmental stages, did Freud describe? 5, but notice, cut off at adolescence. Piaget cuts off at adolescence. Frickin' Erickson's going to take us from cradle to grave, right? And this is I love Erickson, our movement through the 8 stages. And here's the deal. What Erickson is saying is, during a certain period in your life, and the empirical support for this is often questionable, so Eric doesn't sail through, the empirical gauntlet all that easily as well, right? But from 0 to 1.5 years, the conflict that needs to be resolved is, do I trust or do I not trust? And notice, this is a very social aspect, because if you've got cool caregivers who are super consistent, they feed you, they keep a schedule, they take care of your needs, they keep you clean, they keep you warm, they keep you comfortable, they keep your little belly fed, you're going to learn during this period of time, you're going to resolve this crisis saying, you know what, overall, the world is a safe, secure place, and it is okay for me to trust those around me. Now, if you're in a food insecure household and let's say you're abused or abused or neglected, then the message that you learn at this very early age is that the world and the people in the world cannot be trusted. Now, that's the conflict that occurs at the age stage. What happens as we develop? Well, first of all, it makes it hella difficult to get into the next stage if you don't successfully resolve the stage you're in. Also, you might then manifest the issues of the crisis as an adult. So let me ask you this. Do you know anyone who seems to have, as an adult, issues with trust? They just can't seem to trust anyone or trust anything. What we might say then, according to Erickson's ideas, is this person learned mistrust at that age, and it tends to characterize their interactions with other people from here on out. Okay? Now, that's stated a little hard edge. It could be a little more flexible, but I hope you get the idea. Next stage, autonomy versus self-doubt. We can center this around potty training. Look, it's 1.5 to 3 years. Do I learn to recognize that I have an urge, find a place to relieve the urge, clean myself up without soiling my clothes? If I do, this is autonomy. I am taking information and I am acting on it as an autonomous self-serving human being, right? Not needing to go to others. But if during my potty training, for example, my parents are overly harsh, let's say they embarrass me or punish me when I have an accident, then what I'm learning at that point in time is, boy, I don't know if I can do this. Right? If a parent's supportive and you have an accident, they say, oh my God, you had an accident. You've been doing so good with your potty training. Well, let's get you cleaned up and it'll be fine because everyone has accidents, right? And you go, wow, I'm going to figure this shit out. I'm going to get this done. But if your parents are abusive, right, about it, what is wrong with you? Can't you ever get this right? Are you just going to shit yourself for the rest of your life? Well, unfortunately, the problem is they're setting you up to cause that to happen. That is, you have self-doubt. Now, do you know any adults who characterized by their ability, their self-doubt, their inability to believe that they can do something? And notice, we go back to the self-lecture, we can use a different term here called self-efficacy. All right, initiative versus guilt. I'm going to go through the list. We're going to talk about this in greater detail later. But initiative versus guilt is taking it on yourself, starting a behavior. So what happens if you take apart... I'm going to make a joke here. What happens if you take apart the VCR? Kids are amazed by VCRs, right? So that you put the videotape in that machine. How does it work? So some poor kid, while the parents are asleep or gone, takes it apart. And then the parents come home and say, oh my God, what's happened here? And you say, well, I was trying to figure out how it works. And they say, well, you probably shouldn't do that, but I appreciate your initiative. I mean, I understand your curiosity. Or does the parent come home and say, don't ever frickin' touch anything that is not yours again? I don't know what you were thinking, right? And now people are characterized by guilt in their future relationships. Confidence versus inferiority. Are we successful, or do we in fact feel that we're unsuccessful? Notice this also hinges on Adlerian psychology. Adolescence, we talked about in the self-lecture, identity versus role confusion. Do you establish identity, or do you really not figure what you're about? Now, intimacy versus isolation. Look how each stage builds. If I develop an identity, then I'm prepared to share that identity through intimate conversation with a potential partner. But if I've never established an identity, then what the hell, how do I open up to people and how do I share of myself? And I may then be condemned to live in at least partial isolation. So not only does it explain the resolution of the conflict, but it prepares us for the next stage. Now, middle adulthood, this is the midlife crisis, if you will. What's it all about? What's the meaning? And then finally, late adulthood. And this is a cool one, because this is when you're looking back and you say, overall, my life was pretty cool. I did a good job. Ego integrity, or woulda, shoulda, coulda, and it's unfixable. And when I'm sitting in that rocking chair on the front porch, so I descend into despair. So I'm going to leave you then with this little, the little engine who could, but wasn't the engine who could, had an identity crisis. And we'll go on to the next part.